Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Outline of Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Outline of Science, Volume 1, by J. Arthur Thomson. Chapter 5, The Ascent of Man. No one thinks less of Sir Isaac Newton because he was born as a very puny infant, and no one should think less of a human race because it sprang from a stock of arboreal mammals. There is no doubt as to man's apartness from the rest of creation when he is seen at his best, a little lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable! In action, how like an angel; in apprehension, so like a god. Nevertheless, all the facts point to his affiliation to the stock to which monkeys and apes also belong. Not, indeed, that man is descended from any living ape or monkey. It is rather that he and they have sprung from a common ancestry, are branches of the same stem. This conclusion is so momentous that the reasons for accepting it must be carefully considered. They were expounded with masterly skill in Darwin's Descent of Man in 1871, a book which was but an expansion of a chapter in The Origin of Species, 1859. Anatomical proof of man's relationship with a simian stock. The anatomical structure of man is closely similar to that of the anthropoid apes, the gorilla, the orang, the chimpanzee, and the gibbon. Bone for bone, muscle for muscle, blood vessel for blood vessel, nerve for nerve, man and ape agree. As the conservative anatomist Sir Richard Owen said, there is between them an all-pervading similitude of structure. Differences, of course, there are, but they are not momentous except man's big brain, which may be 3 times as heavy as that of a gorilla. The average human brain weighs about 48 ounces. The gorilla brain does not exceed 20 ounces at its best. The capacity of the human skull is never less than 55 cubic inches. In the orang and the chimpanzee, the figures are 26 and 27.5, respectively. We are not suggesting that the most distinctive features of man are such as can be measured and weighed, but it is important to notice that the main seat of his mental powers is physically far ahead of that of the highest of the anthropoid apes. Man alone is thoroughly erect after his infancy is past. His head, weighted with the heavy brain, does not droop forward as the ape's does. With his erect attitude there is perhaps to be associated his more highly developed vocal organs. Compared with an anthropoid ape, man has a bigger and more upright forehead, a less protrusive face region, smaller cheekbones and eyebrow ridges, and more uniform teeth. He is almost unique in having a chin. Man plants the sole of his foot flat on the ground. His big toe is usually in a line with the other toes, and he has a better heel than any monkey has. The change in the shape of the head is to be thought of in connection with the enlargement of the brain, and also in connection with the natural reduction of the muzzle region when the hand was freed from being an organ of support and became suited for grasping the food and conveying it to the mouth. Everyone is familiar in man's clothing with traces of the past persisting in the present, though their use has long since disappeared. There are buttons on the back of the waist of the morning coat, to which the tails of the coat used to be fastened up, and there are buttons, occasionally with buttonholes, at the wrist, which were once useful in turning up the sleeve. The same is true of man's body, which is a veritable museum of relics. Some anatomists have made out a list of over 100 of these vestigial structures, and though this number is perhaps too high, there is no doubt that the list is long. In the inner upper corner of the eye there is a minute tag, but larger in some races than in others, which is the last dwindling relic of the third eyelid, used in cleaning the front of the eye, which most mammals possess, in a large and well-developed form. It can be easily seen, for instance, in ox and rabbit. In man and in monkeys it has become a useless vestige, and the dwindling must be associated with the fact that the upper eyelid is much more mobile in man and monkeys than in the other mammals. The vestigial third eyelid in man is enough of itself to prove his relationship with the mammals, but it is only one example out of many. Some of these are discussed in the article dealing with the human body, but we may mention the vestigial muscles going to the ear trumpet, man's dwindling counterpart of the skin-twitching muscle which we see a horse use when he jerks a fly off his flanks, and the short tail which in the 7-weeks-old human embryo is actually longer than the leg. Without committing ourselves to a belief in the entire uselessness of the vermiform appendix, which grows out as a blind alley at the juncture of the small intestine with the large, we are safe in saying that it is a dwindling structure, the remains of a blind gut which must have been capacious and useful in ancestral forms. In some mammals, like the rabbit, the blind gut is the bulkiest structure in the body, and bears the vermiform appendix at its far end. In man, the appendix alone is left, and it tells its tale. It is interesting to note that it is usually longer in the orang than in man, and that it is very variable, as dwindling structures tend to be. One of the unpleasant expressions of this variability is the liability to go wrong, hence appendicitis. Now these vestigial structures are, as Darwin said, like the unsounded, that is, functionless letters in words, such as the O in leopard, the B in doubt, the G in rain. They are of no use, but they tell us something of the history of the words. So do man's vestigial structures reveal his pedigree. They must have an historical or evolutionary significance. No other interpretation is possible. Some men, oftener than women, show on the inturned margin of the ear trumpet or pinna a little conical projection of great interest. It is a vestige of the tip of the pointed ear of lower mammals, and it is well named Darwin's point. It was he who described it as a surviving symbol of the stirring times and dangerous days of man's animal youth. Physiological proof of man's relationship with a simian stock. The everyday functions of the human body are practically the same as those of the anthropoid ape, and similar disorders are common to both. Monkeys may be infected with certain microbes to which man is peculiarly liable, such as the bacillus of tuberculosis. Darwin showed that various human gestures and facial expressions have their counterparts in monkeys. The sneering curl of the upper lip, which tends to expose the canine tooth, is a case in point, though it may be seen in many other mammals besides monkeys, in dogs, for instance, which are at some considerable distance from the simian branch to which man's ancestors belonged. When human blood is transfused into a dog or even a monkey, it behaves in a hostile way to the other blood, bringing about a destruction of the red blood corpuscles. But when it is transfused into a chimpanzee, there is a harmonious mingling of the two. This is a very literal demonstration of man's blood relationship with the higher apes. But there is a finer form of the same experiment. When the blood fluid, or serum, of a rabbit, which has had human blood injected into it, is mingled with human blood, it forms a cloudy precipitate. It forms almost as marked a precipitate when it is mingled with the blood of an anthropoid ape. But when it is mingled with the blood of an American monkey, there is only a slight clouding after a considerable time, and no actual precipitate. When it is added to the blood of one of the distantly related half-monkeys, or lemurs, there is no reaction, or only a very weak one. With the blood of mammals off the simian line altogether, there is no reaction at all. Thus, as a distinguished anthropologist, Professor Schwabe, has said, we have in this not only a proof of the literal blood relationship between man and apes, but the degree of relationship with the different main groups of apes can be determined beyond possibility of mistake. We can imagine how this modern line of experiment would have delighted Darwin. Embryological proof of man's relationship with the simian stock. In his individual development, man does in some measure climb up his own genealogical tree. Stages in the development of the body during its 9 months of antenatal life are closely similar to stages in the development of the anthropoid embryo. Babies born in times of famine or siege are sometimes, as it were, imperfectly finished, and sometimes have what may be described as monkeyish features and ways. A visit to an institution for the care of children who show arrested, defective, or disturbed development leaves one sadly impressed with the risk of slipping down the rungs of the steep ladder of evolution. And even in adults, the occurrence of serious nervous disturbance, such as shell shock, is sometimes marked by relapses to animal ways. It is a familiar fact that a normal baby reveals the past in its surprising power of grip, and the careful experiments of Dr. Lewis Robinson showed that an infant 3 weeks old could support its own weight for over 2 minutes, holding on to a horizontal bar. In many cases, no sign of distress is evinced and no cry uttered until the grasp begins to give way. This persistent grasp probably points back to the time when the baby had to cling to its arboreal mother. The human tail is represented in the adult by the fusion of 4 or 5 vertebrae forming the coccyx at the end of the backbone, and is normally concealed beneath the flesh. But in the embryo, the tail projects freely and is movable. Up to the 6th month of the antenatal sleep, the body is covered, all but the palms and soles, with longish hair, the lanugo, which usually disappears before birth. This is a stage in the normal development, which is reasonably interpreted as a recapitulation of a stage in the racial evolution. We draw this inference when we find that the unborn offspring of an almost hairless whale has an abundant representation of hairs. We must draw a similar inference in the case of man. It must be noticed that there are 2 serious errors in the careless statement often made that man in his development is at one time like a little fish, at a later stage like a little reptile, at a later stage like a little primitive mammal, and eventually like a little monkey. The first error here is that the comparison should be made with embryo fish, embryo reptile, embryo mammal, and so on. It is in the making of the embryos that the great resemblance lies. When the human embryo shows the laying down of the essential vertebrate characters, such as brain and spinal cord, then it is closely comparable to the embryo of a lower vertebrate at a similar stage. When, at a subsequent stage, its heart, for instance, is about to become a 4-chambered mammalian heart, it is closely comparable to the heart of, let us say, a turtle, which never becomes more than 3-chambered. The point is that in the making of the organs of the body, say brain and kidneys, the embryo of man pursues a path closely corresponding to the path followed by the embryos of other backboned animals lower in the scale. But at successive stages it parts company with these, with the lowest first, and so on in succession. A human embryo is never like a little reptile, but the developing organs pass through stages which very closely resemble the corresponding stages in lower types, which are in a general way ancestral. The second error is that every kind of animal, man included, has from the first a certain individuality, with peculiar characteristics which are all its own. This is expressed by the somewhat difficult word specificity, which just means that every species is itself and no other. So, in the development of the human embryo, while there are close resemblances to the embryos of apes, monkeys, other mammals, and even, at earlier stages still, to the embryos of reptile and fish, it has to be admitted that we are dealing from first to last with a human embryo with peculiarities of its own. Every human being begins his or her life as a single cell, a fertilized egg cell, a treasure house of all the ages. For in this living microcosm, only a small fraction, 1/125th of an inch in diameter, there is condensed, who can imagine how, all the natural inheritance of man, all the legacy of his parentage, of his ancestry, of his long pre-human pedigree. Darwin called the pinhead brain of the ant the most marvelous atom of matter in the world, but the human ovum is more marvelous still. It has more possibilities in it than any other thing, yet without fertilization it will die. The fertilized ovum divides and redivides. There results a ball of cells and a sac of cells, Gradually, division of labor becomes the rule. There is a laying down of nervous system and food canal, muscular system and skeleton, and so proceeds what is learnedly called differentiation. Out of the apparently simple there emerges the obviously complex. As Aristotle observed more than 2,000 years ago, in the developing egg of the hen there soon appears the beating heart. There is nothing like this in the non-living world. But to return to the developing human embryo, there is formed from and above the embryonic food canal a skeletal rod, which is called the notochord. It thrills the imagination to learn that this is the only supporting axis that the lower orders of the backboned race possess. The curious thing is that it does not become the backbone, which is certainly one of the essential features of the vertebrate race. The notochord is the supporting axis of the pioneer backboned animals, namely the lancelets and the round mouths, also called cyclostomes, such as the lamprey. They have no backbone in the strict sense, but they have this notochord. It can easily be dissected out in the lamprey, a long gristly rod. It is surrounded by a sheath which becomes the backbone of most fishes and all higher animals. The interesting point is that although the notochord is only a vestige in the adults of these types, it is never absent from the embryo. It occurs even in man, a short-lived relic of the primeval supporting axis of the body. It comes and then it goes, leaving only minute traces in the adult. We cannot say that it is of any use unless it serves as a stimulus to the development of its substitute, the backbone. It is only a piece of preliminary scaffolding, but there is no more eloquent instance of the living hand of the past. One other instance must suffice of what Professor Lull calls the wonderful changes wrought in the dark of the antenatal period, which recapitulate in rapid abbreviation the great evolutionary steps which were taken by man's ancestors during the long night of the geological past. On the sides of the neck of the human embryo there are 4 pairs of slits, the visceral clefts, openings from the beginning of the food canals to the surface. There is no doubt as to their significance. They correspond to the gill slits of fishes and tadpoles. Yet in reptiles, birds, and mammals they have no connection with breathing, which is their function in fishes and amphibians. Indeed, they are not of any use at all, except that the first becomes the eustachian tube, bringing the air passage into connection with the back of the mouth, and that the second and third have to do with the development of a curious organ called the thymus gland. Persistent, nevertheless, these gill slits are, recalling even in man, an aquatic ancestry of many millions of years ago. When all these lines of evidence are considered, they are seen to converge in the conclusion that man is derived from a simian stock of mammals. He is solidary with the rest of creation. To quote the closing words of Darwin's Descent of Man, "We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." We should be clear that this view does not say more than that man sprang from a stock common to him and to the higher apes. Those who are repelled by the idea of man's derivation from a simian type should remember that the theory implies rather more than this, namely, that man is the outcome of a genealogy which has implied many millions of years of experimenting and sifting, the groaning and travailing of a whole creation. Speaking of man's mental qualities, Sir Ray Lankester says, "They justify the view that man forms a new departure in the gradual unfolding of nature's predestined plan." In any case, we have to try to square our views with the facts, not the facts with our views. And while one of the facts is that man stands unique and apart, the other is that man is a scion of a progressive simian stock. Naturalists have exposed the pit whence man has been digged and the rock whence he has been hewn, but it is surely a heartening encouragement to know that it is an ascent, not a descent, that we have behind us. There is wisdom in Pascal's maxim. It is dangerous to show man too plainly how like he is to the animals, without at the same time reminding him of his greatness. It is equally unwise to impress him with his greatness, and not with his lowliness. It is worse to leave him in ignorance of both, but it is very profitable to recognize the two facts. Man's pedigree. The facts of anatomy, physiology, and embryology, of which we have given illustrations, all point to man's affiliation with the order of monkeys and apes. To this order is given the name primates, and our first and second question must be when and whence the primates began. The rock record answers the first question. The primates emerged about the dawn of the Eocene era, when grass was beginning to cover the earth with a garment. Their ancestral home was in the north in both hemispheres, and then they migrated to Africa, India, Malay, and South America. In North America, the primates soon became extinct, and the same thing happened later on in Europe. In this case, however, there was a repeopling from the south, in the lower Miocene, and then a second extinction, in the upper Pliocene, before man appeared. There is considerable evidence in support of Professor R.S. Lull's conclusion that in southern Asia, Africa, and South America, the evolution of primates was continuous since the first great southward migration, and there is, of course, an abundant modern representation of primates in these regions today. As to the second question, whence the primates sprang, the answer must be more conjectural. But it is a reasonable view that carnivores and primates sprang from a common insectivore stock, the one order diverging towards flesh-eating and hunting on the ground, the other order diverging towards fruit-eating and arboreal habits. There is no doubt that the insectivores, including shrews, tree shrews, hedgehog, mole, and the like, were very plastic and progressive mammals. What followed in the course of ages was the divergence of branch after branch from the main primate stem. First there diverged the South American monkeys on a line of their own, and then the Old World monkeys, such as the macaques and baboons. Ages passed, and the main stems gave off, in the Oligocene period, the branch now represented by the small anthropoid apes, the gibbon and the shamang. Distinctly later there diverged the branch of the large anthropoid apes, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the orang. That left a generalized humanoid stock separated off from all monkeys and apes, and including the immediate precursors of man. When this sifting out of a generalized humanoid stock took place remains very uncertain, but some authorities referring it to the Miocene, others to the early Pliocene. Some would estimate its date at 500,000 years ago, others at 2 million. The fact is that questions of chronology do not as yet admit of scientific statement. We are on firmer, though still uncertain ground, when we state the probability that it was in Asia that the precursors of man were separated off from monkeys and apes, and began to be terrestrial rather than arboreal. Professor Lull points out that Asia is nearest to the oldest known human remains, in Java, and that Asia was the seat of the most ancient civilizations and the original home of many domesticated animals and cultivated plants. The probability is that the cradle of the human race was in Asia. End of this part of Chapter 5.